Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak today about the Chinese Communist Party's economic strategy, and also to touch on a few principles that I believe the United States and other free societies should apply as we hone our collective counter strategy. So the Chinese Communist regime's ambitions really shouldn't be a mystery to us anymore. If we listen to what China's leaders have been saying in their own language, to their own party members, and we cross-reference their rhetoric with their actions, we can see that their plans are really hiding in plain sight. So China's latest 5-year plan was published just last month, and it institutionalizes an audacious strategy for offensive decoupling. So in short, Beijing intends to decrease China's dependency on the world while making the world increasingly dependent on China, and then to use the resulting leverage to advance Beijing's authoritarian political aims around the globe. So the first step of Beijing's new strategy is to use the massive subsidies, the non-tariff barriers, and the continued theft of our intellectual property that Michael was just talking about to wean China off of high-tech imports from industrialized nations while making those same nations heavily reliant on China for high-tech services and supplies. And second, Beijing wants to continue to purchase raw materials and some critical supplies from the outside world, but it's going to work very assiduously and deliberately to ensure that any import from one country can be easily substituted with the same import from another country. And so the strategy really leverages the size of China's economy, what Chairman Xi Jinping calls China's, quote, powerful gravitational field, while simultaneously exploiting the economic vulnerabilities of other countries. So as Xi Jinping said in a seminal economic policy speech last year, quote, we must sustain and enhance our superiority across the entire production chain, and we must tighten international production chains' dependence on China, forming a powerful countermeasure and deterrent capability against foreigners who would artificially cut off supply to China. So don't be fooled by the seemingly defensive phrasing in that quote, because a deterrent is almost by definition an offensive capability, and Beijing is already demonstrating that it is more than willing to use its economic leverage offensively in pursuit of political objectives. You can consider the case of Australia, where Beijing is really treating Australia as a guinea pig on which to experiment with Xi Jinping's new strategy of offensive decoupling. They've been punishing Australian businesses for months, but also released a list of 14 quote-unquote disputes, which are really, in effect, political demands that Beijing's making of the Australian government. And that includes a demand that Australia repeal its laws that are designed to counter Beijing's covert influence operations, that Australia muzzle its free press to suppress news that's critical of Beijing, and that Australia make concessions to Beijing's outrageous territorial claims in the South China Sea. So Australia's travails, which continue to this day, they've been going on for about a year now, are really a foretaste of what Beijing has in store for the rest of the world under this new strategy. Now, fortunately, the United States, our allies, and much of the world have wised up to Beijing's goals. The policy approaches of the Trump administration and the Biden administration really have more in common than not. Allies are generally following America's lead on this, and new legislation, including the Strategic Competition Act and the Endless Frontiers Act, are expressions of the bipartisan consensus on Capitol Hill to counter Beijing's economic and other forms of aggression. So as these bills are fine-tuned before making their way into law, there are 3 quick principles that I'd like to share that I think would be useful to keep in mind. First, in every budget that the United States adopts, in every bill that Congress introduces, and in every partnership that government and industry undertake, we should always ask first whether the new measures that we're considering increase our leverage in this competition or surrender leverage to our opponents in Beijing. As one quick example, Congress is considering the Biden administration's plan for what I've read is a $174 billion amount for electric vehicle incentives. So I would advise that Congress has to entertain whether that plan can simultaneously move our entire supply chain for batteries to the United States. Dr. Nadia Shadlow illustrated in a recent article in The Hill that Beijing currently dominates those supply chains. So it would be the height of irony and really strategic folly if, having recently achieved American energy independence after decades of costly reliance upon the Middle East, the United States suddenly were to make ourselves dependent upon a hostile dictatorship in China for our energy needs. Second, and related to the first principle, is the need to confront the reality that no U.S. counter-strategy is likely to succeed if it doesn't curtail the mighty flow of American capital into China's military-industrial complex. Somehow, Wall Street missed the memo that Beijing is waging an existential fight whose objective is, quote, the eventual demise of capitalism and the ultimate victory of socialism, close quote. That's to quote Chairman Xi Jinping himself. So it's not too much to ask to require American index funds and university endowments, pensions, and venture capital firms to stop funding the expansion of the Chinese empire. Let Beijing finance its own bid for world domination. At the same time, we should really explore ways of reinvigorating American anti-monopoly authorities to use not only against American companies, but against Chinese state-backed monopolies that do at least as much harm to American workers. The Department of Justice has indicted the Chinese telecom company Huawei under RICO statutes, which is to say that the Justice Department views that company as akin to a criminal enterprise. How many other Chinese national champions play by the same rules as Huawei? I think we should ask the Department of Justice to find out. And third and finally, our democratic ideals have the virtue of being not only the thing that we fight to protect, but also are the sharpest tool in our toolkit. Beijing has weaponized almost everything it can think of. It's weaponized trade, data, loans, fishing vessels, social media, diplomats, genetics, you name it. But the one thing that the Communist Party cannot weaponize effectively is what it stands for, because the only thing it stands for is its own power. So we must never, ever neglect the advantage that our values provide us in this fight. And Congress has a very important role to play here by using every opportunity to speak with candor to our businesses, our allies, and to our adversaries as well about what Americans stand for and who we stand up for. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Pottinger. Thank you also for your service. It's deeply appreciated. Miles, we'll go to you now.
Good morning, everyone. Vice Chair Cleveland and Commissioner Wessel and the other distinguished members of the Commission. I'd like to thank you for inviting me today, and you've asked me to discuss the Chinese economy, the philosophical roots of China's economic system, and their implications for the United States. I've submitted to the Commission my written testimony, which is longer, and for a fuller context of my verbal remarks here. My remarks today will focus on what makes the Chinese economy distinct, how it operates, and why it thrives under a monopolistic government that exploits and challenges the global free market system. I'll conclude with the possible possible actions for the United States to take. First, the peculiar and the paradoxical nature of the Chinese economy and the West's role in sustaining it. Unlike most other communist countries, most noticeably the Soviet Union, China has been afforded the benefits of a global free market system. It enjoys largely open access to international trade, capital markets, and advanced technologies. The paradox of a communist nation fully participating in a largely capitalist system has enriched and strengthened the Chinese Communist Party to the point where Beijing poses the mortal threat to the United States and to the very international free market economic system that has enabled the rise of the communist state. In a historic mea culpa, former President Richard Nixon admitted in his later years that his initiative to open up China in 1972 might have created a Frankenstein. China is ruled by the dictatorial communist government that controls the Chinese economy and exploits the global free market system. Today, we see this most clearly in the Chinese Communist Party's ability to exploit the huge supply of cheap and skilled labor at its disposal. This workforce does not have meaningful labor protection. It does not have the right to form and operate independent trade unions to exercise collective bargaining and welfare negotiations. In Xinjiang, the site of the tragic genocide against religious and ethnic minorities, workers were put into camps and have no rights at all. The CCP has created a gigantic country-sized sweatshop, and the world is buying. The party's exploitation does not end with human capital. The Leninist centralized model of governance also means it can command the nation's enormous material resources and effectively pursue the high capital demand landmark infrastructure projects, as in the Belt and Road Initiative. These include extensive highway and railway systems, wasteful and environmentally destructive housing and hydroelectric mega projects, and of course, expensive weapons of war in the conventional and nuclear arenas, as well as asymmetrical areas like space, cyber, deep sea, and biogenetics. The CCP's monopoly on power also allows Beijing to impose strict control over financial resources, forcing non-state businesses to rely on state financing and banking institutions. In a similar vein, the CCP is unrelenting on currency control and restrictions on currency flow, which makes foreign investors often unable to send profits out of China. This creates a vicious cycle where investors are left with no choice but to keep adding on more and more capital infusion into their Chinese investments. Foreign companies also face challenges in accessing to Chinese consumer market. The government-inspired and encouraged xenophobia makes many foreign brands victims of crazed national boycotts and mob hooliganism. While the advent of the Bitcoin age poses a challenge to all central banks, China views the digitalization of national currencies as an opportunity to increase its surveillance of its own people and to upend the US dollar-dominated global trade settlement and transactional monitoring system. It is taking ominous steps to explore that opportunity. China's currency control also severely restricts Chinese citizens' ability to send money abroad. This creates a destabilizing factor for the global currency system, including rampant money laundering activities. Well, the final point I'd like to make in this section is about information. Transparency is anathema to the Chinese Communist Party, including when it comes to economic data. It makes arbitrary economic growth objectives based on political impetuses rather than credible economic numbers. Lack of transparency also endangers American investors, as many of the Chinese state-owned enterprises listed on Western capital markets provide vague and opaque information, often keeping their financial records hidden from regulators and investors in free market economies. I'd like to close by answering a question that Vladimir Lenin would have asked: what is to be done? First and foremost, the United States should no longer ignore the enormous political and ideological differences between the Chinese Communist Party and the free world systems. A fully free market system of international trade cannot coexist peacefully with a socialist market economy with Chinese Communist Party characteristics. The first step I would recommend for the US government to take is an item-by-item reciprocal response to China's negative list. That list is also known as Special Administrative Measures for Foreign Investments Access, and it constitutes a comprehensive list published annually by China's Development and Reform Commission that specifies all areas and sectors where foreign investments are allowed or not allowed in China. A reciprocal response would prohibit Chinese investments in the United States in areas such as high-quality agriculture seeds, social surveys, humanities and social science research institutions, critical minerals mining, news organizations, radio and television productions, film studios, cinemas and theater chains, and the cultural performance troupes, etc., etc. The second step I would recommend is involves reciprocity for America's private companies. Congress could create a mechanism for them to register complaints about discrimination by China. The ban on Facebook and Twitter in China should not be a Facebook and Twitter problem, but an American problem. Based on this information, the US government could take sovereign reciprocal actions against China. As it is, too many American companies are effectively held hostage by the CCP and resort to the permanent class of China lobbyists and registered agents for China, whose job is to sell, whose job is to sell corporate America access to senior Chinese officials so that they can continue making big profits and not offending the CCP autocrats, thus perpetuating America's corporate woes in a communist country. The third step, I think is the most important, is for America to once again recognize the importance of leadership. The economic challenge of the Chinese Communist Party is not a matter of if we should or should not change Beijing's paradoxical economic reality. It is a matter of if we don't change its behavior, the free world will be changed by Beijing. The Chinese Communist Party's inner circle is based on the understanding that China's struggle with America and the free world is nothing but a zero-sum game. In a world of geopolitical great power competition, the United States can and must win. And thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on this important topic, and I look forward to your questions and to working with the Commission.